welcome to John Bruce and Linda Steer to a conversation about the board's role in strategic planning. But before we get to that, it might be useful, Linda and John, for you to first give people kind of an idea of what is strategic planning? What are the components? How do you see it? What does it involve?
Linda, you'll answer this far better than I. And I'll tell you if you're correct.
Well, strategic planning is born of a management tool to project into the future. Like if you're creating a goal, or there's an accomplishment to be had by an organization, and people know how to set goals, but strategic planning is fundamentally assessing yourself against the competitive environment. Where are you positioned with regards to that? If there's a particular goal you want to accomplish, it helps to shape what actions you need to take, or what things you need to be aware of to take action on with anything that may be coming up in the future, so that you can position yourself and plan for success. Is how I would. Yeah.
So that sounds like taking a particular area that needs some attention and beginning to frame something around it. What about the entire organization? I mean, is the strategic plan the vision, the mission, or is it really around the goals instead of those higher level things?
I think it's around the entirety of it. It would be around the entirety of it. I often relate to it as how do you get the what's so about something, the reality of the current universe, or the expected universe inside which you're operating, so that the actions you're taking can anticipate any roadblocks along the way and position you to succeed with what you want to accomplish. And there are many different ways that, different kind of philosophies around strategic planning, as Robert is pointing out in the chat field.
Yeah.
It's a plan that flows out of identifying strategic issues. So there are the strategic issues, not only the ones that you're creating as a strategic issue that you want to accomplish, but also what is the minefield out there, the environment that you're operating inside of, that you can assess, how that you're not roadblocked in the future by that which you can anticipate now. So,
John, you mentioned early on, before we got on this call, in the pre-interview,
yep,
you mentioned that you were interested in beginning discussions with a board that you're working with on strategic planning. Is there any particular philosophy that you've been thinking about using?
It was, in a sense, an evolutionary kind of approach that I've been casting my eye and my mind back over the 3 meetings that the board has had so far. And you've got to bear in mind, it's 4 volunteers and nobody else. And I'm looking to then see if I can define what might be emerging strategic decisions, and what may be associated with success, and what may be associated with risks. But to me, the strategic would be, they're on the lines of must do if you want to be successful. The thing that clouds it for me at the moment is the degree of short-termism or long-termism that's available. The organisation has been in existence literally for a few months, and to talk about a 5-year plan, for example, to talk about goals 5 years hence, to think of a vision for us 5 years down the road, is in many ways quite useful, I think, because we can work towards sharing that same kind of intention. But the issues that, of course, cloud our vision at the moment are very, very next 12 months sort of stuff. And what I'm concerned about is I don't want us spending time on the next 12 months if that's not aligned to something bigger and longer term. And by the way, culture is one of the issues that boards are being shouted at more and more in terms of what kind of organisation do you want in cultural terms? What are the values that we want the organisation to be held up for? And that's also a particularly interesting one when we have a doctor, a management consultant, managing director of an infrastructure business, and an accountant. So it'd be interesting to see what we might share. A long-term plan, Robert informs me, is different from a strategic plan. Okay, Robert.
Well, I have a question. Can I ask a question? Just sort of some background.
Yep.
So, John, you said that they've existed for a few months. So I just wanted to get clear. You're talking about the governing board, but it also sounds that the governing board also is there staff?
No.
So there's not a split currently between the functioning of a governing board, which is looking at the value, the fundamental underlying values, the long-term positioning of this organization, which is going to land more from a governing standpoint. But then you've got the board also being the management execution of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It seems like it would be useful to separate in your discussions what is talking about the underlying values and the longer term framework inside of which managerial kind of short term 1 year planning could get done, or multi-year plan. I mean, obviously from a governing standpoint, you're interested that the multiple year forward looking, anticipating the environment kind of thinking gets done. Not necessarily that the board does that, but if you're one and the same, it might be useful at this point for board members to get that there's two types of thinking that you're doing that might help them not be so solely focused on the immediate issue at hand, but that there's a larger framework that's required for it.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, it's helpful. I think because we're very energized, I don't want to find us digging too big a hole for ourselves before we realize we're in a hole. And I do want us to be very focused about what we think of as success. And success over the longer term will have to include all these kind of strategic issues about who might we partner with and how will we determine what the big risks are and what the big opportunities are. All of that needs to be done, but I'm curious really about the start point. Do we just sit and vision for a while and say, okay, so that's what we want to be when we're grown up? What do we need to do to begin that journey?
It would seem to me that an exercise in strategic thinking, where are you positioned in the environment? What are the current capabilities, which are elements of a strategic plan, but that kind of strategic thinking being done such that, what you're shaping. I'd imagine that the discussions of dealing with the shorter term management of the shorter term is going to go a lot easier if you've got some strategic framework to view it through.
Yes.
So John, in the chat, I posted a monograph from the American Hospital Association, their Center for Governance, on successful strategic planning and the board's role. It includes some of the things that Linda's been talking about, like what is vision, what are values, what's environmental scanning, and might be useful just as a touch point.
Thank you.
Yeah, because you have a board that is all volunteer at this stage, it's not useful to think about, well, what's the management's domain, because you don't have that. It's more, it all belongs to the board at this point, and the board needs to be able to at once manage what's going on in the short term, but at the same time be able to look ahead and say, what, as you mentioned, what do we want to be when we grow up? And I think what's really going to be most important for you is to be able to set the tone for that time that you spend together. About we can't be confined or hamstrung by where we are now or what we see for the next 12 months. We need to be thinking about what this is actually going to look like in 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And that's hard. That's really tough because people tend to want to remain focused on what they can see now. And so that could be difficult.
Yes. I think I'm just, in a sense, grappling with the fact that the board's time together has been very, very thin.
Mm.
And it's tempting to kind of say, well, let's wait until we're ready.
Right.
But I that would be my armchair view. But I don't want to wait. I don't think we should wait. I think we need to start doing the thinking beyond the thinking that we've done. And it may well be that the thinking that we've done is sufficient to satisfy what might be a strategic imperative, if you like. But we haven't had the conversation to decide if that is so, as well as all the differences of point of view about what do you mean this kind of strategic plan or that kind of strategic plan.
Yeah. And that's an important point, is having that time to get to know one another and
Yes.
and really begin to successfully mine the wisdom that's around the table is a challenge. So I'll just throw in a pitch here. If you can afford to hire somebody to facilitate, that way everyone there and the board can participate.
Mm-hmm.
And participate fully. And I particularly see that that's a challenge for small organizations. I'm doing one for an organization for a small honorarium, but it's because the person who's been in the role like you have been to kind of bring some professionalism to the board and to help them understand their role and do all of that. She just finally said, I need to be able to sit in that chair and speak with you all as opposed to be sitting in this chair and having to run things. And
yes.
That would just be my 2 cents on it.
No, thank you. That's certainly one of my tensions. What hat am I supposed to be wearing? What hat am I wearing? Thanks.
Yeah. Maybe you've got a good friend who could come in and if you do all of the, as this client did for me, they did all the pre-work for me and are doing all the pre-work for me. So I just really show up and make sure I'm capturing things on easels and keeping things moving. So yeah. Just thought I'm just throwing that in. So we have the situation where John is in a place where his board needs to own the strategic plan at this point because that's it. Robert raised a few large cap comments in the chat room that typically the strategic plan does belong to management or the CEO as opposed to the board. Are there any thoughts that either of you have regarding the board's role when there is a management team?
I think the board has a role, and it may well be particularly around this cultural element of saying what matters for the board, and articulating that in such a way that the board says, yes, this is what's important to us. So chief executive, in developing your way forward, we need to be able to recognise in your plans that our concerns and wants have been accounted for or will be accounted for. And whether it is of the cultural variety or of the material variety, in a sense, is neither here nor there because the board decides what matters to the board. But I think for a chief executive, it's really important that the board does its best to articulate that, because it gets you away from this trying to second guess for a chief executive who's struggling to make sense of something that hasn't been said, and trying to second guess what the board thinks, and trying to second guess what the board really means. And by the way, does everyone around the board table agree with it anyway? So I think for me, the board's connection with the plan is the bit that kind of surrounds it. And certainly from a governance perspective, it's the piece that surrounds it. The chief executive doesn't tell you what you want. You tell the chief executive what you want. But you have to be able to articulate it, because if you don't, a good, slick chief executive will fill your mind with chief executive stuff as if it was yours, and you'll surrender your right to govern.
That's an important point. And
yeah.
Go ahead, Linda.
Well, I agree with John. I look at it from a sports analogy standpoint, but I look at it that, basically the board is laying the playing field. What constitutes winning? What are the rules of the game, and where are the boundary lines? So that of all the various choices that the CEO is going to be the one management team on the ground, knowing the capabilities of the organization and the specific challenges of the environment, and of all the myriad of choices that they could take. They do need to know what constitutes success. That's where the board's got the higher view of it. And what's going to be guiding the choices that they do make strategically, which ones are essentially going to be unacceptable given the culture of the organization. That pretty much defines the culture. Here's how we're operating. Here's the manner with which we operate. And we're not going to make the kind of choices that are going to land us in rough ground as defined by the board. So it helps to shape, which I think from a CEO standpoint would be welcome for a CEO, because oftentimes of all the myriad choices, what do? They need to keep going back to board meetings to get approval for something, hamstrings them in being able to move forward. So having that defined ahead of time, and they can be free to play.
Right. I mean, it's classic. The questions that a CEO will ask is, well, when do I need board approval? And sometimes, that's a subjective call. From the CEO's point of view, if it seems like it's a risky decision, well, let's get the board involved. So then, I can point to the board as part of the reason if this fails. And if it's something that I really want to have happen, well, I'll just do it and then ask for forgiveness later, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So, in what circumstances do I need to go to the board for approval? And if the board hasn't been clear about that, then it's totally subjective.
Yeah, and the board has to take responsibility for not being clear. I think, it's like saying the CEO done wrong, but if the board wasn't clear, it needs to own up.
Yes.
And you do need a way for the board to know whether it's done or not. A thought that just came to mind from a corporate environment of those, you have large corporations, and then there's some ethical breach somewhere along the way. There have been some offshore accounts, or there's an incentive that gets set that the highest profit to the shareholders is success. Now, people have done that in many ways. I mean, recently there's a large bank in which there's one department, and they came up with how many dummy false client accounts in order to make quota, right? So there's something that drives the incentive of that. But if the board hasn't set that specifically, that, listen, you can't rob the bank in order to make a profit. Yes. But if that's not set, right, if the board hasn't taken responsibility for something, then, obviously it landed in legal trouble because there are laws that still have to get made, but
Yeah.
It's always astonishing to me that a large corporation would never, that kind of activity happens, and that people feel that they can do things unethically or illegally in order to meet some kind of quota so that they keep their job, but they lose it ultimately anyway if they get caught doing something illegal. So,
I don't want us to shift away from strategy too much, because what you're saying there, Linda, is really interesting. But I'm suspecting that if
that's
we're not
another
careful,
topic.
Yeah.
if we're not careful, we will be in a different place.
Thank you.
I guess the thing for me, what I'm taking from this at the moment, is do we share a picture of what matters to us, and what are the major decisions that have got to be made by the board in the absence of a CEO. There are other decisions the board's got to make anyway, just in terms of what matters to us. But what are the major decisions that need to be delegated to somebody to start delivering on? And we know what some of those decisions are. We just haven't formalised who is responsible for what bit in terms of a plan. And I think everyone around the table is used to having a plan for something, but it will be a management plan or a clinical plan or a financial plan, but it wouldn't necessarily be a corporate stroke strategic stroke are we on the right road, and are we accomplishing or on the way to accomplishing the big win, not just minding the parlour, but are we accomplishing the big win or witness?
So that what I'm hearing, if you like setting a goal by the end of the year or so, and then creating a plan to get there, would be very easily accepted by people.
Yes, I think to some extent, though, you see, we have that, and I think for me, there's a so what that has to be kind of asked. So we want to create a clinical advisory group. So what? It would help me understand the importance of that by having the conversation around the table. So what does that mean to us? So that we can have a shared understanding. I don't think it should be my decision about whether it should be an advisory group, but given that we reach a stage where we think a clinical advisory group is a good idea, then we should have argued the fors and against it, so that when it does its work, we can recognise what it's doing. Or we could say, hold on, that wasn't what you said you were going to do.
That's an interesting point, John, because often people have a lot of good ideas about what ought to be done, but they haven't really thought through how does this really change something for us going forward, and what does it ultimately end up looking like? And an easy one is like public education. Well, we should always be educating the public about what we're doing. Well, that's great, but what does that mean? And what does that look like? And how do we know what the public needs to know that is useful? All of those things need to be kind of fleshed out. And until somebody makes a point of it, like you're doing, John, to say, you've got a lot of great ideas. You've stated a lot of things that you value about what it is we're doing here, which is great. But ultimately, how does that transcend into us being the kind of organization that creates the change that we want?
Yeah,
that's excellent. So on that note, I think we've had some really good discussion about both the board that doesn't have management team and their role in looking ahead and crafting the future, and also we talked a bit about the board's role in setting the tone at the top for the strategic plan. Any other takeaways you two want to share before we close this one?
There's some great chat coming through from Robert, and I'm sorry that I haven't had time to read it all. But, sorry, Linda. Yeah.
No, I think that the chat is a valuable just think that we could keep on going with regard to just addressing the chat. The one thing I just wanted to offer out, if you have if you're at the beginning where you've got this group of people who are looking to function both as a governing and a managing element at the same time at the very beginning of something, and if a group is not, like, they're so taken up by the immediate issues at hand that have to get dealt with that there's just no space for, we should be thinking bigger. I was thinking that there'd be a way of addressing it, that whatever people want to address, whatever the options that come up for addressing the short term could get extrapolated up, right? So the question could be, how do we know that this choice is going to be the best way to go rather than this way? And if there's a lot of energy for that, there's something in the background that's leading to what could potentially be defining the longer term, what success is longer term, right? So even, it doesn't matter wherever you're starting from, but there could be a way of being able to create a larger framework, even if somebody may not be attuned to want to take the time to just do that first before dealing with the immediate.
And I just have one final thing to add, is that I think it's important for the board to be explicit about what its values are, whether or not it has a management team. And the reason is because you need some criteria against which to judge those decisions that you're going to make. So I want to thank you both for a lot of rich discussion and dialogue today around strategic planning and the board's role. And we're going to pop back on to Fuse, right, for a debrief. All right. Thank you both.
I have 3 minutes.
Yes.
All right. Well, let's do it quickly. We'll jump back on Fuse.